All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 1 o'clock briefing today. Better biology instruction for a more equitable society. Our briefing will run through 1:45 today, at which point we'll have a hard stop, but speakers could be available for additional questions in a follow-up area. So we have with us today 4 speakers and also 3 co-organizers on the briefing. I'll introduce them now. They are Brian Donovan, a research scientist at BSCS Science Learning in Colorado Springs; Keith Hunley, associate professor of anthropology at the University of New Mexico; Amelia Hubbard, associate professor of anthropology at Wright State University; and Joseph L. Graves, Jr., associate dean for research and professor of biological sciences at the Joint School of Nanoscience and Nanoengineering, North Carolina, A&T State University, and University of North Carolina, Greensboro. We also have with us today the 3 co-organizers of the event who are seated in the front row. And they're Michael Carson, the professor of biological sciences at Bridgewater State University; Jonathan Beckwith, American Cancer Society professor and emeritus professor of microbiology at Harvard Medical School; and Kostya Bergman, associate professor emeritus of biology at Northeastern. So we'll get started today. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name's Brian Donovan, and our whole symposium today is going to address this larger issue that science is a human endeavor, and throughout history, the science of genetics has been used to support prejudiced views about human difference, and it's also been used to challenge those same views. And we're going to argue, therefore, that teaching about human genetic variation is not a socially neutral endeavor in our society, and that if we want to do a good job educating students about human biological difference, we need to attend to the social and also the quantitative complexities of research on human genetic variation. So each of our talks is going to address one of those issues. So today I'm going to argue that biology education can affect the development of racial prejudice during adolescence. I've conducted 6 randomized control trials with around 1,300 middle and high school biology students. And these studies demonstrate that depending on what we teach students about human genetic variation and how we teach it, it can lead to increases or decreases in cognitive forms of prejudice among adolescent age students. And before I get into the findings of my research, I first want to discuss or highlight how 2 related misconceptions about human genetic variation could affect the development of prejudice. So, for example, one example of a misconception is that people of the same racial group are genetically uniform in their variable DNA. And you can see that in the picture on the right on the screen. Another example of a misconception is that racial groups categorically differ in their variable human DNA as well. Now, if a student develops the misconception that people of the same race are genetically uniform, then that could affect the development of stereotyping, because stereotypes imply that all people within a group are the same. And if a kid develops the idea that racial groups categorically differ in their variable DNA, that could facilitate stereotyping by leading students to believe that human racial groups differ in all kinds of other meaningful ways because of genetics. And so in 3 recently published randomized control trials, I've shown that when students read textbooks discussing the prevalence of genetic diseases in different racial groups, so diseases like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, it can affect the development of racial prejudice by leading students to infer that racial groups differ in intelligence and academic ability because of genetics. And that, of course, is a problem, because these students are not learning about intelligence in textbooks when they're reading about human genetic diseases. These effects appear to be an unintended consequence of learning about differences in the prevalence of genetic diseases. So students are making these inferences on their own. And I think that raises an interesting possibility, which is that if genetics education affects the development of racial prejudice through its impacts on how kids understand human genetic variation, then by teaching students more accurate understandings of human genetic variation, we might be able to run that process in reverse and reduce racial prejudice. And so what I'm talking about is helping kids develop a more accurate model of human genetic variation. So in reality, people of the same group are genetically variable in their variable DNA. And people of different groups, while they do differ, they don't differ as drastically as many people might think. So that's not to ignore the fact that there are group level differences. It's just to help kids contextualize it better. And in a soon-to-be published paper in the journal Science Education, my research team is reporting the results of 3 additional randomized controlled trials. And those studies show that when we teach students about the quantitative and social complexities of human genetics variation research, we can actually reduce stereotyping and the belief among students that racial groups differ in intelligence or academic ability because of genetics. And so what I mean by that is if we teach kids these accurate models of human genetic variation and we explain to them why the models I showed you earlier are biologically flawed, then we can reduce prejudice. And I think what all this boils down to is that teaching about human genetic variation in our society, it's not socially neutral, and I don't think we should treat it that way. My research is beginning to show that biology education can either increase or decrease cognitive forms of racial prejudice, and I think that's one reason why we have to be really careful to communicate the nuance and complexity of genomics research when we're teaching the public about genomic science. Thank you.
Darren, could we get the next set of slides, please? Thank you.
My name is Keith Hunley. I'm a genetic anthropologist, a human evolutionary geneticist. I study human origins and prehistory. I'm pushing it.
Might have to get closer.
How's that? Better? Thank you. Sorry about that. So I'm going to give a talk. I'm brought in on this sort of as somebody who's going to talk about the complexity of human genetic diversity. And so I'm going to give a talk entitled The Apportionment of Human Diversity Revisited. And each year, anthropologists at U.S. universities teach thousands of students that the chief reason that biological races don't exist is that the genetic differences between so-called races are small, and in the words of Richard Lewontin, of virtually no genetic or taxonomic significance. This finding appears to be undermined by genetic studies that show that the genomes of individuals from around the world fall into clusters that correspond to more or less conventional racial classifications. So in my talk, I attempt to reconcile our teaching about the non-existence of biological races with the results of these genetic studies. I show that the cluster analyses are misleading to non-specialists because they wrongly imply that the genetic differences between groups are large and that the differences between individuals within groups are small. So analyses that take into account our evolutionary history show 3 things. They show first that successively nested subgroupings are necessary to account for the structure of human genetic diversity. These subgroupings do not accord with conventional racial classifications, and traits that have been influenced by natural selection map onto environments, not onto races or regions or even populations. And then methods, I conclude by talking about how methods that geneticists use to depict geographic patterns of genetic diversity are not socially neutral, and absent explicit evolutionary context, they may reify pernicious stereotypes.
And I'm Dr. Amelia Hubbard. I'm also a biological anthropologist, and as you'll see, my perspective comes from that background. A lot of my approach to this subject is based on experiences teaching about these topics in the college classroom. And when I talk about biology, I try to contextualize it within a deeper social and cultural context of norms about science, more generally, and then also about race and genetics specifically. So as Brian has said already, this is a very complex topic and hard to sort of refine down to really easy, digestible bits. But I think if we don't attempt to address these, then as we will also demonstrate in our talk later today, we are going to basically fall prey to students filling in the blanks. So there's kind of 3 things that I'm going to talk about more broadly in my talk this afternoon, but I'll mention now. And my message is here that we have to think about how we as Americans teaching in an American classroom, how we think about race. A lot of the ways in which we define concepts like race, ethnicity, genetic ancestry, and nationality are all tied to social and cultural norms about how we see the world. The reality, though, is that when we are addressing these in the college classroom, and this is sort of a message to the educators that might be reading anything you write, is that we have to begin by teaching what we mean when we say the term race and what we don't mean when we say the term race. I think there's a lot of confusion about what people are talking about. Sometimes they'll say genetic ancestry and mean race and use these terms interchangeably. The second point I want to make is that as an anthropologist, I think it's very important, and also others have demonstrated in social science and in natural sciences, that we have to take a biocultural approach. So there's really two core components to that. The first is that we can't teach racial differences as attributed to biological, or more specifically genetic differences, as Keith has just talked about. But we also have to be really explicit about why this is the case, the history behind, again, how ideas about race have been constructed. And then further, the second component of that then is teaching not only why race is not biological, but how the effects of racism, as our perceptions of race are constructed, actually do impact the well-being of people in our world. So with my students, I'll often say, well, if race is not biologically based, but race is real, I guess we move on. This isn't appropriate for a biology classroom. But the reality is there's a ton of scientific literature demonstrating that the effects of racism through stress and through something called epigenetic tagging is actually being carried over generations, especially in people of color. And then the third point is that we're really missing out on opportunities. You have, for lack of a better term, a captive audience in the especially introductory college science classroom. And by remaining silent, you're not really remaining neutral. You're just not talking about a subject that, again, the students are going to make assumptions about anyway. So those are sort of the three things that I'd like to emphasize, I guess, related to my talk today. And Brian mentioned a couple of pieces of his. I think I also sent out, I have pieces in the American Biology Teacher that you should have received that talk more specifically about the approach that I use.
My name is Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr. I am by training an evolutionary geneticist. I am the discussant on the panel, and my role will be to synthesize the take-home points that the speakers make in our session this afternoon. For those of you that are not familiar with my work, I have been working in this area of the connection between biological and social conceptions of race for well over 30 years. I've written two extremely popular books on the subject, one that deals with the explicit history of how we became racial thinkers in the Western world, called The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, that was published by Rutgers University Press back in 2005, and also The Race Myth, which is a book about the consequences of our ongoing racial thinking in terms of how it causes various pathologies in our society.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. We can take questions now from reporters. If you raise your hand, a mic will be brought to you. Kindly state your name and affiliation before your question. Okay. And I know that Dr. Graves, you were the author on a letter. I believe there were over 60 geneticists who signed it with you. That was published, was it within the past year? Could you talk a little bit about that, perhaps, and the response to it?
Yeah, you may remember that Professor David Reich of Harvard wrote a book, Who We Are and How We Got Here. Before its publication, there was a piece, op-ed piece in the New York Times in which Professor Reich essentially claimed that the results of his studies invalidated the idea that human racial groups were socially constructed. After reading the piece in the New York Times, I and several other scholars, geneticists, social scientists, anthropologists, wrote a response to that piece, which the New York Times declined to publish, but we were able to get published in BuzzFeed. That came out on March 30th, 2018. I then found out, after I actually read his book, that he called me out by name in the concluding chapter as a defender of the orthodoxy concerning human biological variation going back to Richard Lewontin's 1972 paper. I have since responded in one book chapter that's about to be published later this year, and I will be working on a full-length book response to Professor Reich concerning his claims about ancient DNA derailing the views of modern evolutionary geneticists and anthropologists about human biological diversity.
Okay, we have a question here.
William Waddell, Idlewild Town Crier. This is a question for Brian. Could you give a few examples of how a biology book for, let's say, high school students could be written to avoid some of these stereotypings?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. It's one I'm asked often. I think one implication of my research that sometimes people make is that if genetics education unintentionally increases prejudice, then we should take race out of the textbooks. And I actually don't think that that's what we should do. So I think the answer to the problem of something as complex as how people develop, say, stereotypical beliefs is to directly address the complexity of biological variation. And I don't know that that can necessarily be done simply through a textbook. I think it involves more complex forms of instruction where we get kids to look at genetic data, argue about what it means, develop models to explain human variation, and arguably it takes a very long time. My studies suggest that when we do it that way, so when we have kids argue about the meaning of data about human genetic variation over prolonged periods of time, so we're talking on the order of about 5 45-minute class periods or more, then we can move the kids incrementally, but in a statistically significant way to lower levels of prejudice. And I think if you wanted to talk about that more with me, I could show you pictures and examples of how it works, but it'd be very difficult to do it right here like this.
And maybe a question about that, Ryan. If you were doing some of that work in the younger student body, and then they got to you, Amelia, would there be a different kind of conversation you would still need to be having with them at that point, or do you think so much could be done to change minds in the younger cohort? For both?
Is that who would you like to start?
You could either one.
Well, I'll let Amelia start and talk about her experiences first.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say right now, most of the students coming into my college classroom have not been exposed to these ideas at all, and they'll often say, oh, I wish I had learned this in grade school. So it's kind of hard to predict exactly what the difference would look like, because right now we're essentially teaching similar ideas of what Brian is trying to get into that K through 12 curriculum is very similar to what we're teaching at the college level, because particularly in a lot of intro to biology courses or in my bioanth course, these are large courses of students, and you have a mixture of people who have a biology background and a large proportion, especially in my course, that are non-majors. So they may not know some just basic biology and they need a refresher, especially if they're adult learners and haven't had a class recently.
And can I follow up on that? So I think another thing to recognize is that there's a maturation effect in how kids develop stereotypical beliefs that occurs in late childhood and early adolescence. So it's kind of a developmentally ripe time to work with kids about how they think about other groups of people. And I think part of the problem perhaps is the way that we teach genetics. So we emphasize Mendelian models of inheritance, like genotype, phenotype, single gene relationships with traits. And we don't want to throw Mendel out with the bathwater. Like, Mendel does a good job of explaining a few kinds of human variations, but the vast majority of things that kids are interested in their social worlds are things like behavior, ability, stuff like that. And Mendel does an exceedingly poor job of explaining those kinds of variation. And so I think part of the problem is that when kids walk into the 7th or the 8th grade science classroom with questions like, why do I look like my mom and my dad, or why do I look different from them? A biology teacher has a really quick and simple explanation. Like, they're like, look at this Punnett square. Mendelian genetics can explain this for you. And sometimes it does, but there's a lot of complexity that's even glossed over there. And so I think we need to help contextualize Mendel better in the kind of trajectory of biology education that kids have. And if we address some of these complex issues about complex traits and deal with all of that difficulty, which is going to take a lot of research and teaching to do, we could potentially make a significant impact on the development of stereotyping.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add to that, and I'm not sure that folks in the audience understand how badly the American public understands these issues of genetic causation. And that has societal implications. So if you believe that there are genes for single Mendelian traits like intelligence, like industrialness, like personality, then you think that, well, if some groups are falling behind in some of these social measures, well, that's due to these simple genes that they have, and the reason we're doing better is because of the genes we have. And that, of course, easily derails any sort of social activity to alleviate these disparities that exist in society. So if people are sick, it's because they have bad genes, not because there are aspects of the way they're living and are forced to live that are making them sick. And you often see this kind of genetic reductionism occurring in the most authoritarian, despotic societies. And unfortunately, this one has taken a turn in that direction in recent years.
Question over here.
Hi, Mia DeGraff, Daily Mail. In terms of genetic risk factors or risk factors for health that we understand that quite often, especially in the US, that you'll say, okay, you're a certain race, you are at risk for certain illnesses or diseases. How do you go about communicating that in a more nuanced way?
Do you guys want me to take that?
I think we can all address it. Yeah, you should go ahead.
So, again, it goes back to some of the things that Brian was mentioning in his talk with regards to how we teach genetics to start with. And this is true even at the university level, where much of what is taught is what I would call genetic reductionism. There's a gene, there's a specific trait, and then you get the phenotypic outcome, in this case, disease. But it turns out that the things which are particularly associated with health disparities, like heart disease, cancer, stroke, et cetera, these are polygenic, are influenced by polygenic influences. And therefore, they're strongly associated with environmental differences. And so what I argued in the race myth is that when you looked at most of the health disparities between African Americans and European Americans, that in fact they are best explained by environmental differences and not genetic ones. Taking, for example, hypertension. I actually looked at the genes associated with hypertension, the genetic variants, and showed that they were actually in higher frequency in persons of European descent as compared to persons of African descent. And so if your model was genetic, you'd expect that European Americans would have greater incidences of hypertension than African Americans. In fact, we see the opposite pattern.
I think this is also a nature of science problem. So similarly, just as with genetics, the American public and also our students don't necessarily have a strong background in genetic training. A lot of times, the problem is that people also don't really know how science works. They think that we're searching out these finite truths and there's one answer and then we're done. And I think as Joseph sort of has addressed, part of this is whether it's in the classroom or we're getting messages out, we have to be teaching people how science works as well, and that change is okay. I think about an example, piggybacking on what you said about like osteoporosis risk. If you look on the FDA label on calcium supplements, there's still a really old disclaimer sort of statement about the research that was done, which if you look into the research wasn't complete, but it basically puts people of different races into different kinds of risk based off a study on cadavers of people of two races. So it wasn't even good science in the first place, and it was a long, long time ago, but it has continued to be perpetuated. And I think, that also ties into just aspects of society. We've talked about it too. Science isn't about one finding. It isn't about one scientist's idea. It's about a collective body. And so often I think it's hard among people who are reading, say, science news to say, oh, well, I read here that this said this. But if they were to look at the whole body of work and science news, 20 years ago, science news today, and then also some of the research, they would actually find more of what we're talking about. It's just hidden because people will focus on the one thing that they see that reconfirms what they think they know. And it's not an inherently bad thing about people, it's kind of how we're trained to be in a sense, right?
To say something quickly, I think we have this notion that there are variants that are unique to certain groups. There are genes that are unique to certain groups, and that's almost never the case. So what you're looking at is traits that all humans have. They're just variable in frequency. And so there is also variation among groups in their ability to metabolize certain drugs. But when you look at the data, maybe one group has a 10% of one population can't metabolize a particular drug, and you look at another population, it's 12%. In both cases, the vast majority can't metabolize the drug. Not only that, you're just looking at one variant. There are lots of other variants that might influence the ability to metabolize that drug. So it's important to realize that it's really rare to find even big frequency differences between groups in terms of these drugs, these genes that metabolize drugs.
And I want to build on that a little bit. So there's a question of like, what do we tell the public through reporting? It's kind of the same problem. Like I taught biology. It's the same kind of problem a biology educator has, is like, how do you teach someone or communicate about really complex things when your reader is not necessarily an expert, right? And so I think there are some ways you can approach it. One of the things is that novices differ from experts in a lot of different ways. So experts have more differentiated knowledge. So like an expert can look at data and say, well, what would the data have to look like to perfectly support what the claim is that this person's advancing? What would it look like if it refuted this claim? And I think there are some ways that journalists are now starting to deal with this issue, especially around reporting on climate change that I've seen in the Times, where you get a graphical narrative where you walk through data in different ways, and there's a narrative that helps people to interpret the data. And what that kind of reporting is doing is it's kind of structuring out the noviceness, right? People make sense of text through their prior knowledge. That's one of the most replicated findings in all of the education. I mean, back to the 1970s, which is a long time in education, right? So it's really important to acknowledge the fact that people probably don't always read about this stuff with the kind of prior knowledge that an expert would, and that therefore there's kind of an extra burden to help unpack that complexity. And I can talk more with you afterwards. I think there are some special things you could do that would make it a little bit easier for people to make sense of the complexity, but I think that's kind of what it comes down to.
I have a question here.
A brief comment. Robin Williams from the ABC in Sydney, followed by a question. The brief comment is that when human beings came to Australia 65,000 years ago, and a reminder that civilization is about 10,000 years old, 65,000 years ago, when Bennelong was taught to speak English, Bennelong being an Aboriginal person, it took him just a matter of a handful of years to write a complex letter. The brain was already fixed to understand language and to write a letter in English. But my question is, what did you make of Jim Watson's recent reiterated comments?
Well, for those who are unaware, I was actually in the documentary Decoding Watson. The producers gave Jim Watson an opportunity to appear on camera with me to discuss that very issue, and he refused. And so at the end of the day, he was set in his beliefs concerning human genetic variation and its association with intelligence. As I have pointed out in numerous venues, that is a tenuous relationship for which there's no proof. Even David Reich, in his conclusion of who we are and how we got here, admitted that there are no genomic variants associated with any particular group's greater intelligence than another group. So this is a case of a firmly held belief by Watson, almost akin to creationism, where you don't require any evidence, you simply say that something is true. Now, of course, we do have a history of institutional racism, and we do have patterns of educational attainment and other measures that people associate with genes. But the simple fact of the matter is that scientifically there is no such association. And the evidence more strongly speaks to that history of institutional racism with regard to people's educational attainment and cognitive performance in a variety of avenues.
I think there's another issue too to broaden this to back to what I was saying in the beginning is that science is a history of ideas and arguments. And in science, we try to come up with explanations for how the world works or for observed patterns and phenomena. And scientists argue with each other, and the purpose of the argument is to close down the debate. And I think it's important that when we talk about issues of race and genetics, for kids to learn that the science of genetics has been used to support prejudice, and it's also been used by scientists to confront prejudice. And when you look at that debate, what you get is essentially what Dr. Graves is saying, is that there is a consensus understanding that the argument has closed down, by and large, that racial differences in complex traits don't have a simple, easy genetic explanation. And at the same time, people will acknowledge that there is a heritability to some traits and that there is a genetic basis to complex traits. But I think it's also important, I don't think the public understands this all the time, that even when a trait has a genetic basis, that doesn't mean that it's not malleable, that it's fixed and thus cannot change, and therefore that differences that we observe are intransigent. And so there's a kind of, I think, a way around that science education really hasn't taught people about, which is like, we have bodies. Bodies are produced by genetic recipes, and we can expect to find associations between genes and complex traits. But the causality that's involved is exceedingly complex, and we don't really do justice to that within science education to help kids avoid kind of like what I would call genohype, or hyping up the genetics of the explanation.
Question?
Hello, Sophie Bates from UC Santa Cruz. I have a question for Amelia. So you mentioned that race isn't biological, but that the effects of racism can impact people's health. Can you expand on that and maybe give some examples?
Yeah, so if you look in the literature right now, for example, there's a lot of studies looking at maternal death risk as an example. A lot of times people refer back to, I think it was Serena Williams, who had a baby, and she's economically wealthy, she's got status, but it's not that people are discriminating against her in a hospital bed that's made her birth difficult. It was because through the effects of racism and over generations through her family, it's quite possible that she, like others, has inherited not a change to her at the gene level, but actually this thing called tagging, or epigenetic tagging, where mechanisms for affecting the expression of that gene, right? So expressing the DNA gets inherited, and that thing can, again, turn things on and off or mess with the actual outcome. And so we see that it doesn't really matter necessarily, I should backtrack. It does matter. We need to fix socioeconomic problems, but we also need to acknowledge that the effects of stress, just generally, Bob Sapolsky's talking about this at noon. He does this study in baboons and humans, right? Stress kills, literally. Stress does have effects. And that stress and then those tagging events literally, again, impact our health, our well-being, and to a certain extent our genetics in a way, right? And then just again, you mentioned hypertension. So when we look, there was Lorena Madrigal, who's a medical anthropologist, had looked at this effect of hypertension, and you would expect that if it was a racially specific trait, it would be something that was could be found in people around the world. But in fact, what she found is it was rates of hypertension in Black American societies were higher than in Black populations anywhere in the world, because of the literal effects of the stress of racism. It doesn't mean there isn't racism in other parts of the world, but that seemed to be more of a risk factor, the stress of the day-to-day institutional racism, as opposed to salt intake or genetic predisposition to high blood pressure, right? So those are some of the ways that directly and indirectly with the genetic components, people every day are affected biologically by the social phenomenon of race and racism. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, and to add to that, it's been well known for some time that in biological sources of death, African Americans lead European Americans in 24 out of 26 categories. So to try to answer that genetically, you'd have a really difficult time making a genetic argument for 24 out of 26 categories. And what makes that even more insane is that when you look at the genome of persons of African descent and persons of European descent, you actually find more deleterious mutations in persons of European descent. And so therefore, again, if you were looking for a genomic argument for 24 out of 26 categories, you would again expect persons of European descent to be leading in those categories, but it's the exact opposite. And so there are numerous examples of how institutional racism kills people. One of the best is, again, in hypertension and stroke, where in fact in persons of African descent, African Americans, people at higher incomes are more likely to die from stroke than persons of lower income. So that's exact inverse relationship from what you see in persons of European descent. Now, this has been explained by a number of scholars through something called the weathering effect or the out of place principle, and I've experienced this myself, being the first African American in history in my field, in which because people do not expect me to be there, I take a much higher burden of stress home with me every day. And routinely at my university, it's another funeral of another person that's listed campus-wide. This person died, that person died, that person died. And when I was at a majority institution, I never saw that.
Great. Thank you. Well, if there aren't any other questions, thanks so much to our speakers. That was extremely informative, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.